What would you do if all you had left was a single dollar and the memory of smoke? For Sadie Polk, homeless at 19 in the muddy streets of Providence, Missouri, that question wasn't a flight of fancy. It was the hard truth of an autumn morning in 1884. The boarding house where she'd worked for her keep was a pile of wet, black bones, and everything she owned had turned to ash on the wind. But the forgotten wreck she bought with that last silver dollar held a secret that could either rebuild a town or drown it for good. The river had taken much in its time, but it was about to give something back. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from, as we tell a story of what happens when the deepest wreck holds the highest hope. Sadie Polk stood before the town clerk's office, the dollar coin feeling thin and cold in her palm. Her coat, a threadbare thing she'd grabbed from a fleeing boarder, smelled of soot and fear. Her face, usually pale, was smudged with gray, and her long braid was heavy with the damp morning air. She had walked the length of Providence since dawn, from the blackened ruin of her old life to the indifferent storefronts lining the main street. Every door was closed to her. There was no work for a girl with no people, no roof, and no possessions but the clothes on her back. She was a ghost in her own town, visible only as a problem to be avoided. She had heard the whispers, the clicks of tongues. That's Polk's girl. Just like her father, ending up with nothing. The memory of her father was a dull ache, a man who had chased dreams up and down the Missouri River until one day he simply didn't come back, leaving behind nothing but debts and a reputation for folly. Her gaze drifted past the clerk's window toward the riverbank, where the skeletal remains of a paddle steamer lay half swallowed by mud and time. The wandering star. Even as a child, it had been there, a monument to failure. The story was that its captain, a man named Elias Vance, had vanished 20 years prior, taking the boat's payroll and leaving it to rot. It was a town joke, a landmark of bad luck. But for Sadie, looking at its broken spine and listing deck, it wasn't a joke. It was a shape. It was a roof of a sort. It was something to own when she owned nothing else. She pushed open the door to the clerk's office, the bell above it giving a weary jingle. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose face was a roadmap of disappointment, looked up over his spectacles. Sadie. Heard about the fire? A terrible thing. His voice was dry, official. Nothing I can do for you. Town council has no funds for charity cases. Sadie didn't flinch. She had not come for charity. She placed her single dollar on the worn wooden counter. I want to buy the Wandering Star, she said, her voice quiet but clear. Abernathy blinked, then let out a short, dry laugh. The wreck? Child, that's not property. That's a hazard. It's on the town rolls, Sadie stated, her gaze unwavering. For back taxes. $1. She knew this because her father had once considered buying it himself, another of his grand, failed schemes. The clerk stared at her, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, or just bewilderment in his eyes. He sighed, a long, rattling sound. He pulled a dusty ledger from a shelf, blew a cloud of grime from its cover, and flipped through the brittle pages. He found the entry, a faded line of ink. He dipped his pen, scratched out a name, and wrote hers in. He took her dollar. Sold, he said, with the finality of a man washing his hands of a fool. The folly is yours. He pushed a brittle deed of sale across the counter. As she took it, her fingers brushed against his expression softened for just a moment. Be careful down there, Sadie. The river keeps what it takes. The warning hung in the air, heavier than the smell of old paper and dust, As she walked back out into the indifferent light of day, the deed to a ruin clutched in her hand. The paper felt impossibly fragile, a whisper of ownership for a ghost of a boat. Walking back down the main street, Sadie felt the weight of eyes upon her. The news had already spread, carried on the wind like gossip or disease. She saw the women sweeping their porches stop and stare, their mouths forming tight, disapproving lines. Men leaving the general store paused, nudged each other, and smirked. The purchase was not just an act of desperation. In their eyes, it was an admission of defeat, a final embrace of the Polk family legacy of failure. She clutched the deed tighter, its sharp edges digging into her palm. This wasn't a surrender. It was the only move she had left to make. The boat was a place to be. A place that could not burn down because it was already ruined, already given over to the water. It was a place where no one could evict her, for who would want it? It was a kind of freedom bought for $1. She thought of her father, a man who saw potential where others saw only rust and rot. He would have understood. Or perhaps he too would have thought her a fool. The line between vision and folly was one she was now walking herself. As she neared the edge of town, a carriage rattled to a stop beside her. Mayor Gable, a man whose prosperity had grown in direct proportion to the town's quiet hardships, leaned out. He was thick-set, with a face that seemed permanently flushed with self-satisfaction. He held a smoking cigarillo in a gloved hand. "Well, I'll be," he boomed, his voice dripping with false congeniality. "Sadie Polk, I hear congratulations are in order. The new captain of the Wandering Star." His laughter was loud and wet, an ugly sound that made Sadie's jaw tighten. "That boat was a bad investment when it was floating, girl. Now it's just mud ballast. You've wasted your last $1. Sadie met his gaze and said nothing. Her silence was a wall he could not breach, and it only seemed to amuse him more. "Just like your father," he added, his smile turning cruel, "always reaching for things that were already sunk." He flicked his cigarillo into the mud at her feet, a gesture of casual contempt, and ordered his driver to move on, leaving Sadie standing in the wake of his dust and derision. Her face burned, but her resolve hardened into something cold and solid. Let them laugh. Their laughter couldn't make her any colder or more hungry than she already was. What secret could possibly be worth salvaging from a tomb of mud and splintered wood? Was this an act of desperation, or the first step toward a future no one could see? Let us know what you think in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for more stories like this. For Sadie, the answer was waiting behind a single, swollen door. The whispers followed her all the way to the riverbank. They were a current in the air, a rustle of judgment in the dry autumn leaves. Polk's girl, buying Polk's folly. Some things run in the family. She ignored them. Her focus narrowed to the path ahead, a muddy track that wound down through skeletal cottonwoods to the water's edge. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows that made the familiar landscape seem strange and unwelcoming. As she rounded a bend, she saw an old woman sitting on a fallen log, mending a fishing net with gnarled, patient fingers. It was Elspeth, a woman who lived in a shack downriver and was regarded by the townsfolk as half-wild, a creature of the river itself. She was ancient, her face a web of deep lines, her eyes the color of the murky water, holding a depth that seemed to see through skin and bone. Elspeth didn't look up as Sadie approached, but she spoke, her voice raspy like stones grinding together. "They're laughing at you up there," she said. It wasn't a question. "I know," Sadie replied, her own voice barely a whisper. Elspeth knotted a thread with a deft twist of her fingers. Laughter is the sound of fools who can't hear the river talking. She finally lifted her gaze, and her eyes fixed on Sadie with an unnerving intensity. You bought the star. Again, not a question. Sadie simply nodded, the deed still in her hand. Elspeth looked from Sadie's face to the wreck sitting silent in the shallows. That boat ain't empty, she murmured, a strange gravity in her tone. Some captains don't abandon their ship. They just wait for a new pilot. The old woman's words were cryptic, settling into Sadie's mind like silt, cloudy and unsettling. She didn't know what to make of them, but they felt less like a warning and more like a pronouncement. She left Elspeth to her nets and continued down the path, the mayor's scornful laughter echoing in her memory, clashing with the river woman's strange prophecy. The two voices represented the town's judgment, the loud public mockery and the quiet private mystery. One dismissed her as a fool, the other hinted at a purpose she couldn't yet comprehend. She pushed them both aside. What mattered now was shelter. What mattered was surviving the night. The town had written her off. Mayor Gable had publicly humiliated her. Even the well-meaning pity of the clerk felt like a kind of dismissal. She was alone, armed with a worthless deed and a cryptic blessing from a woman most people avoided. She had been cast out, and her only refuge was the very thing that symbolized her family's, and now her own, perceived failure. But as she stood on the muddy bank, looking at the dark, hulking shape of the riverboat, a strange sense of belonging settled over her. This was hers. This wreck, this folly, this tomb of splintered wood and rust. It had waited for her, and she would not abandon it. The journey to the boat was a slog through thick, greedy mud that sucked at her worn boots with every step. The air grew cooler near the water, carrying the damp, earthy smell of decay and wet leaves. Reeds, tall and brittle, whispered around her as she pushed through them. The wandering star loomed larger as she approached. Not a boat so much as a fallen giant. It was canted hard to port, its starboard paddle wheel shattered, its once white paint peeled away to reveal the gray, waterlogged wood beneath. The main deck was a treacherous landscape of broken planks, slick with moss and algae. It looked even more hopeless up close. A profound sense of disappointment washed over Sadie, cold and sharp. The faint hope that had carried her here began to wither. Mayor Gable was right. This was nothing but mud ballast. This was a grave. Still, she had nowhere else to go. She found a section of the upper deck that was relatively level and swept clear of the worst of the debris. As the last light of day bled from the sky, turning the river to a sheet of hammered copper, she sat down, pulling her thin coat tight around her shoulders. The silence was immense, broken only by the gentle lap of water against the hull and the groan of the boat settling deeper into the mud. It was a lonely, mournful sound, the sigh of something that had been dying for a very long time. She didn't sleep much that first night. The wood beneath her was cold, and the boat shifted with the river's current, a slow, rhythmic rocking that felt less like a cradle and more like the breathing of a dying animal. From the shore, a pair of yellow eyes watched her. A stray dog, its ribs showing like a washboard beneath its matted fur, stood silently at the edge of the reeds, too wary to come closer but seemingly unwilling to leave. It was as much an outcast as she was. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, Sadie rose, stiff and chilled to the bone. The dog was still there, a patient, lonely sentinel. She felt a kinship with the creature, They were two survivors on the edge of the world, drawn to the same forgotten place. She decided to explore her new, dilapidated kingdom. The main cabins were ruined, their doors hanging open, their interiors filled with mud and debris from years of floods. It all seemed to confirm her initial despair. This was a place of endings, not beginnings. But as she made her way toward the stern, she saw the captain's quarters. It was set higher than the other cabins, and while the rest of the boat listed and sagged, this section seemed strangely solid, its lines straighter, its construction more robust. The door was closed fast, the wood dark and swollen tight in its frame. It looked impassable. A feeling of finality, of a journey ending at a locked door, began to settle in her heart. The sun was higher now, its pale light glinting off something on the door. Sadie moved closer, her boots squelching in the thin layer of mud on the deck. It wasn't the wood of the door itself that held her attention, but the hardware. While the ironwork on the rest of the vessel was pitted with rust, eaten away by 2 decades of exposure, the hinges on this door were thick and black, barely touched by corrosion. The lock was a heavy brass plate tarnished to a deep green brown, but it was intact, solid, its keyhole a dark, forbidding slot. This was not the work of a simple riverboat carpenter. This was the work of a man building a vault, not a cabin. The door was not just closed, it was sealed. It was a statement of intent. The rest of the boat had been left to the mercy of the river, but this one place had been fortified against it. The contrast was stark, a single point of order in a world of chaos. Why would a captain lavish such expense and care on one door, on one small room, while the rest of his vessel was built to more ordinary standards? It didn't make sense. It was a detail that refused to fit. The stray dog, which had finally padded its way onto the boat, came to stand beside her. It didn't bark, but let out a low, soft whine. Its nose pointed directly at the base of the sealed door. It seemed to sense it too, that this was not just another ruined room. This was the heart of the wreck, and it was still beating. Sadie ran her fingers over the cold brass of the lock plate. Beneath the grime, she felt a small, almost invisible marking. She scraped at it with her fingernail, revealing a single, elegantly carved initial, an E. Not for Vance, the captain whose name was on all the official records, Elias. It was his initial. But it was the style of it, a looping, almost feminine script that felt out of place. It was a personal mark, not a maker's mark. It was a sign of pride, of possession. This room was more than just the captain's quarters. It was his sanctuary, his safe. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, a distant lesson from his workshop. Always look at the joints, Sadie. The way a man joins 2 pieces of wood tells you everything. It tells you what he wants to protect and what he's willing to let go. This door was a joint between the world and whatever Captain Vance had wanted to protect. The challenge of it sparked something in her, a flicker of purpose in the cold ashes of her despair. She had a key of a sort, her father's knowledge, and she had a tool, her own stubborn refusal to be defeated. The town saw a wreck. Mayor Gable saw a joke. But standing before this defiant door, with a silent, watchful dog at her side, Sadie Polk began to see a question that demanded an answer. What was inside that was worth protecting so fiercely? What secret had Captain Elias Vance bolted shut before he disappeared into the river's gray mist forever? The next days fell into a rhythm of labor, a steady beat of effort against resistance. Sadie's world shrank to the few square feet of decking in front of the captain's door. Her first task was to find a lever. She waded into the murky water beside the hull and wrestled a long, solid-looking piece of oak from the shattered paddle wheel. It was heavy, slick with algae, but it was strong. This would be her crowbar. Her silent companion, the stray dog she had started calling Drift, never left her side. He would lie in a patch of sun, his head on his paws, watching her with intelligent, patient eyes. When she paused, exhausted, he would rise, stretch, and nudge her hand with his cold nose, a quiet encouragement to continue. He was a constant, living presence in the profound silence of the wreck. She began her assault on the door. It was not a matter of force. The wood was too thick, the iron too strong. It was a puzzle of leverage and weakness. She remembered her father showing her how to unseat a stubborn nail, not by pulling it straight out, but by working it back and forth, loosening the wood's grip grain by grain. She applied the same logic to the hinges. She wedged the tip of her oak lever into the tiny gap between the hinge plate and the doorframe and began to work, putting her entire weight into it. The boat groaned in protest, but the hinge didn't budge. Her hands, soft from her work in the boarding house kitchen, were soon raw and blistered. The blisters broke, and her palms bled. She tore strips from the hem of her petticoat to wrap them, the clean white fabric quickly turning brown with grime and rust. Every muscle in her back and shoulders screamed. At night, she would collapse onto her patch of deck, sharing the stale crust of bread she'd found in a discarded sack with Drift. The dog would eat his small portion delicately, then curl up near her feet, a warm, breathing anchor in the cold darkness. During those long hours of work, her mind would drift back to her father. She remembered the smell of his workshop, sawdust and turpentine and sweat. She remembered the feel of his calloused hand guiding hers as he taught her to use a plane, to read the grain of a piece of wood. "Don't fight the wood, Sadie," he'd say. "Understand it. Every piece has a story, a direction it wants to go. You just have to listen." He had been a dreamer, a man full of plans that never quite solidified, but he had known things. He had understood the secret language of wood and iron. That knowledge, his only true inheritance to her, was what she now clung to. It was a connection to him, a way to make his failed dreams mean something. She was not just prying open a door. She was trying to prove that the Polk legacy was not just one of folly. After 3 days of relentless effort, something shifted. A groan, not from the boat, but from the metal of the top hinge. A sliver of rust flaked away, and the massive iron pin inside moved a fraction of an inch. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Hope, sharp and bright, surged through her. She focused all her energy on that one spot, working the lever back and forth, ignoring the fire in her muscles. The pin began to slide, slowly at first, then with more ease, until with a final screeching complaint, it came free. The top of the door sagged inward, its weight now hanging entirely on the lower hinge and the lock. She had found the weak point. She had listened. The bottom hinge gave way more easily, and soon the door was held only by the tarnished brass lock. She stood back, breathing heavily, sweat and grime streaking her face. The door was canted, broken, but still locked. Through the gap at the top, she could smell the air from inside, stale, dry, with the faint, papery scent of time itself. It was the smell of a place that had been waiting, undisturbed, for a very long time. Drift rose to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his eyes fixed on the dark opening she had created. The secret of the wandering star was close now. She could feel it. Just on the other side of the wood and brass, the lock was the final guardian. Without a key, it seemed an impossible barrier. Sadie spent a full day examining it, probing the keyhole with a piece of wire, trying to understand its mechanism. It was no use. It was a high-quality tumbler lock, far beyond her ability to pick. Defeated, she slumped against the opposite wall of the passageway, the silence of the boat pressing in on her. Drift came and rested his head on her lap. As she stroked his matted fur, her eyes fell upon the captain's logbook, which she'd found earlier, half submerged in a waterlogged crate. Most of it was a pulpy, illegible mess, but she had saved it on the faint hope it might contain something of value. Now she picked it up again, idly flipping through the stiff, mildewed pages. The ink had bled into abstract blooms of black and blue. But the last few pages, at the very back of the book, had been protected by a thick leather flap. They were damp, but the writing was still clear. The final entries were dated from the spring of 1864. They were mostly notations of cargo and river conditions, but the very last entry was different. It wasn't about the boat. It was a short, cryptic sentence. The key is in the heart of the promise. The heart of the promise. The words meant nothing to her. She read them again and again, trying to decipher their meaning. What promise? Whose promise? She looked back at the door, at the elegant carved E beside the lock. Elias. And then she noticed something else. The logbook's cover was made of thick, pressed leather. In the center was an embossed emblem, a stylized star. But it felt thicker there, stiffer than the rest of the cover. A strange intuition, a spark of insight, made her take her knife. A small, dull blade she used for cutting bread, and carefully slit the stitching around the emblem. She peeled back the top layer of leather. Tucked inside, flat against the bookboard, was a small, intricately shaped iron key. It was cold to the touch. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She scrambled back to the door, her hands trembling so much she could barely fit the key into the lock. It slid in perfectly. With a deep, satisfying click, the tumblers aligned and the bolt withdrew. The door swung inward with a low groan, opening into darkness. She held her lantern high and stepped across the threshold. The air inside was still and heavy, like the air of a tomb. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but nothing was disturbed. A narrow bunk, a small desk, a chair, all bolted to the floor, and there, beneath the bunk, was a heavy iron chest, its surface pitted with age, also bolted fast to the thick oak planks of the floor. It wasn't just a sea chest. It was a safe. A profound sense of awe washed over her. She had found it. She had opened the door to the boat's secret heart. Now she just had to open the chest itself. The key to the door did not fit the chest's formidable lock. But as she ran her hands over its cold iron surface, she found another inscription, almost invisible in the dim light. It was a name, Eleonora, and beneath it, a date. The same date as the last entry in the logbook. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was a placid gray canvas. The next, it was a churning mass of bruised clouds, and the wind began to howl like a hungry wolf. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid wind-driven sheets that lashed the river's surface into a frenzy. The wandering star, which had rested quietly for 20 years, began to move. It groaned and shuddered as the rising water lifted it from the mud's embrace, its old timbers screaming in protest. Sadie, still inside the captain's quarters, felt the deck heave beneath her feet. The lantern flickered wildly, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. Her first thought was for the chest. She had to protect it. She tried to move it, but it was bolted fast, an anchor holding the room's secrets to the boat's very soul. The river was rising with terrifying speed, brown water swirling over the main deck, carrying debris that hammered against the hull like a battering ram. The boat was being torn apart. Through the roar of the wind and rain, she heard another sound, a human cry, thin and desperate. She rushed out of the cabin and saw it. A small farm wagon caught in the flash flood that was turning the riverbank into a torrent had overturned. A man and a woman were clinging to the wagon's wheel, while two small children were being swept away by the current. Without a second thought, Sadie grabbed a coil of old, thick rope from the deck. She tied one end to a cleat, the other around her waist, and plunged into the churning, icy water. The current was a physical force, trying to drag her under, but she fought it, her eyes fixed on the small, struggling forms of the children. She reached the boy first, grabbing the back of his shirt and hauling him toward the boat. She got him onto the relative safety of the listing deck and went back for his sister. The parents, seeing what she was doing, fought their way toward the boat as well. By the time she had pulled the little girl from the water, Sadie was exhausted, her limbs numb with cold, her lungs burning. The family, the Millers, huddled together on the deck, soaked and terrified, but alive. "Thank you," the man said, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved us." Sadie could only nod, her teeth chattering too hard to speak. The storm raged around them, a symphony of destruction. The boat pitched and rolled, threatening to break apart at any moment. Sadie herded the family into the most sheltered part of the upper deck, a small, stable-like structure that had once housed livestock. She gave them her own thin blanket and worked to secure loose planks that were being torn away by the wind. She was no longer just protecting a secret. She was protecting lives. Her own quest for fortune felt small and selfish in the face of the storm's fury and the family's terror. She had brought them aboard her ruin, her folly, and now their survival depended on it holding together. Throughout the long, terrifying night, she stood watch, the wind tearing at her, the rain soaking her to the bone. She was a captain now, not of a proud steamer, but of a broken refuge, her crew a family of strangers. She had made her choice. She had used her sanctuary to shelter others, committing herself fully to the fate of the wandering star and all who were aboard it. When dawn finally broke, the world was quiet, washed clean and utterly transformed. The storm had passed. The river was still high and brown, but it was no longer a raging monster. The Miller family was safe, huddled together but unharmed. The wandering star had held. It had lost more of its decking, and the port side was lower in the water than ever. But its heart, the captain's quarters, was still intact. As the first rays of sunlight touched the deck, Mr. Miller approached Sadie. His face was etched with exhaustion and gratitude. "We owe you our lives, miss," he said, his voice thick. "We lost everything. Our wagon, our supplies, everything." Sadie looked past him, to the iron chest still bolted to the floor in the cabin. She had something. She didn't yet know what it was worth, but it was something. "Let's see what we can salvage," she said. She returned to the cabin, Mr. Miller following her. The chest was still locked. The name, Eleonora, and the date were the only clues. "Eleonora," she murmured. It felt important. She went back to the logbook, to the last entry. The key is in the heart of the promise. What if the promise was a person? What if the key was a date? She traced the numbers of the date with her finger. April 16th, 64. A combination. She returned to the chest and saw that the lock was not a keyhole, but a complex dial mechanism she hadn't noticed in the dark. She carefully turned the dials. 4, 16, 64. A heavy clunk echoed in the small cabin. The lock had opened. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy iron lid. Inside, everything was perfectly dry, wrapped in oilcloth. On top lay a stack of official-looking shipping contracts. Beneath them was a thick packet of documents tied with a faded red ribbon. She untied it and fanned them out. They were land deeds. Mr. Miller, looking over her shoulder, let out a sharp gasp. He pointed a trembling finger at one of the deeds. "That's my name," he whispered. "That's my father's name. That's our farm." He explained that his family, along with several others, had lost their land to Mayor Gable years ago. The mayor had bought up their debt during a bad harvest, claiming their original titles, which were supposed to arrive by river, had been lost. But here they were, delivered to this boat, but never delivered to the families. Beneath the deeds was a heavy leather wallet. Sadie opened it. It was filled not with cash, but with bearer bonds from the St. Louis Union Bank, their paper still crisp. It was the payroll, the money Captain Vance had been accused of stealing. He hadn't stolen it. He had locked it away for safekeeping before he disappeared. News of the Miller family's rescue and the discovery on the boat traveled with the speed of a telegraph wire. Mr. Miller, holding his family's rightful deed, became Sadie's staunchest ally. He insisted on escorting her to the county seat, to a lawyer he trusted. The town of Providence watched as Sadie Polk, the girl who had bought a wreck, rode out of town with a rescued family and a locked box. Their expressions no longer filled with mockery, but with a dawning, confused respect. The tide, it seemed, was beginning to turn. The lawyer in Clarksville, a man named Silas Croft, was old and sharp, with eyes that missed nothing. He listened to Sadie's story without interruption, his steepled fingers resting on his chin. He examined the deed to the Wandering Star, the land titles, and finally, the bearer bonds. He held one of the bonds up to the light, studying the watermark, the signature, the engraving. A low whistle escaped his lips. "These are genuine," he said, his voice holding a note of awe. "And because they are bearer bonds, ownership lies with whoever holds them. They are as good as gold." He did a quick calculation on a piece of scratch paper. The total value was staggering. It was a fortune that could build a town from the ground up. "And these deeds," he continued, tapping the stack of papers, "they are legally binding. They were registered. They just never reached their owners. Captain Vance was transporting them as a registered agent." The picture became clear. Captain Vance had not been a thief. He had been a custodian. When his boat went down or got stuck, he had secured the most valuable cargo, the deeds and the bonds, in his custom-built safe, intending to retrieve them. But he had vanished, and his secret had remained locked away for 20 years. Mr. Miller's story and the identical stories of a half-dozen other families painted the rest of the picture. Mayor Gable had known those deeds were coming. He had likely been tracking the boat. When the Wandering Star failed to arrive, he had used the opportunity, buying up the family's debts and seizing their land under the guise of lost paperwork, knowing full well their proof of ownership was sitting in a wreck at the bottom of the river. The return to Providence was different. There were no whispers, no smirks. The townspeople watched Sadie and Mr. Miller ride back in, their faces filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The truth, carried ahead of them by rumor, had unsettled the town's foundations. Mayor Gable met them in the street, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a pallor of fear. "This is nonsense," he stammered as Mr. Croft, who had accompanied them, presented the deeds. "These are forgeries. They have been verified by the county registrar," Croft said calmly. "The same office where you filed your foreclosures, Mayor. The dates will be quite illuminating." Gable's face crumbled. He was not a monster, just a greedy, opportunistic man who had been caught. He was humbled not by force, but by the quiet, undeniable weight of the truth. He didn't fight. He knew he was beaten. Within a week, the deeds were restored to their rightful owners. A quiet revolution took place in Providence, not of anger, but of restoration. Families who had been tenants on their own land for a generation were suddenly owners again. The chorus of townspeople, who had once laughed at the girl buying a wreck, now looked at her with a kind of reverence. She hadn't just found money, she had unearthed a buried history. She had returned to them something they thought was lost forever: justice. Sadie Polk, the girl with nothing, had given them back their homes, and in doing so, she had finally found her own. The late autumn sun cast a long golden light across the water, turning the muddy Missouri into a river of liquid honey. Sadie stood on the deck of the Wandering Star, a hammer in her hand. The boat was still a wreck, but it was no longer a symbol of failure. It was her home. With a portion of the money from the bonds, she had hired a crew of men, Mr. Miller and his neighbors among them, to help her raise and repair the vessel. They weren't restoring it to a working paddle steamer, but to something new. The lower decks were being converted into a warehouse for the farmers to store their goods, a cooperative venture that would give them leverage against traders from the city. The upper decks were being rebuilt into a small, clean boarding house. Drift, no longer gaunt but sleek and content, lay sleeping at her feet, his tail thumping softly against the freshly laid planks. The laughter and scorn of the town were a distant memory, replaced by the sounds of saws and hammers, the sounds of building. The people of Providence no longer called her Polk's girl. They called her Miss Polk, and they said it with respect. She had not kept the fortune for herself. She had invested it in the town, in the people who, like her, had been dismissed and written off. She had established a fund to guarantee fair prices for their crops and had paid off the town's debts. She had healed the wounds that Mayor Gable's greed had inflicted. Mr. Miller walked up the gangplank, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked around at the bustling activity, at the new life being breathed into the old wreck. "It's amazing what you've done, Miss Polk," he said, his voice full of sincere admiration. "What are you building here, anyway?" Sadie looked from the boat to the newly plowed fields on the shore, where families were working their own land with a hope they hadn't had in years. She looked at the quiet town, now stirring with a new sense of purpose. She thought of the cold, lonely girl who had arrived here with nothing but $1 and a memory of ash. She was no longer that girl. The river had given her more than a fortune. It had given her a purpose. "A harbor," she said quietly. "Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet courage. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasure isn't what you find, but what you restore." If you were moved by Sadie's journey, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more tales from the frontier. We'll see you next time. Delia Sharp was 18 and disowned. She had no family left to speak of, no prospects, just a worn leather satchel, a geologist's hammer from her father, and $92. And with that $92, she bought a worthless, played-out mining claim on the barren slope of Mount Davidson, a place rumored to be cursed. But what nobody knew was that buried beneath the collapsed timbers was a secret 2 centuries old. a secret that would challenge the most powerful men in Nevada. Settle in with us for her story, and let us know in the comments what part of the country you're watching from. Delia's life had been shaped by two things: the fine, sharp dust of the Comstock lode, and the quiet, steady love of her father, Thomas Sharp. He was not a miner, but a claims clerk, a man who lived in a world of paper and law, yet understood the mountain better than most men who gouged its depths. He saw the world not as dirt and rock, but as a ledger of geologic time, a story of pressure and heat written in strata of quartz, andesite, and diorite. He had come to Virginia City in the first rush, not with a pickaxe, but with a sharp mind and an honest hand, finding his fortune not in silver, but in the meticulous recording of the claims of others. He taught Delia everything. While other girls learned needlepoint and pie crusts, Delia learned to read a transit map, to distinguish fool's gold from chalcopyrite by its heft and brittleness, and to understand the precise, unforgiving language of the Mining Act of 1872. Her classroom was the dusty claims office, its long counters scarred with the ink of 1,000 frantic filings, its air thick with the scent of old paper and the faint, metallic tang of ore samples. Her father would unroll a brittle map, his finger tracing the neat squares that divided the mountain into a patchwork of hope and ruin. "The law, Delia," he would say, his voice low and patient, "is like a good timber. It must be sound, well-placed, and respected. Without it, everything collapses." His most treasured possession, and now hers, was a geologist's hammer, its steel head forged in Sheffield, its hickory handle worn to a silken smoothness from the constant pressure of his palm. It was a tool of inquiry, not destruction. He used it to read the rock, to tap gently at an outcrop and listen to its story. He taught her how to hold it, how the balance was everything, how to feel the vibration of the stone travel up the handle into her bones. 2 years ago, the mountain he had so diligently chronicled had finally claimed him, not in a sudden collapse or a fall, but with the slow, patient cruelty of the dust. Miner's lung, the doctor called it, though Thomas had never spent a day underground. The fine silica dust was everywhere in Virginia City. It settled on every surface, coated every throat, and over 17 years, it had turned his lungs to stone. After he was gone, Delia was sent to live with his only living relation, his younger brother Silas, a foreman for one of the smaller mining outfits. Silas was not a cruel man, but he was a pragmatic one, worn down by hard work and the constant anxiety of providing for his own wife and 3 daughters. Delia became a shadow in their cramped wooden house, another mouth at a table where there was seldom enough to go around. The transition from tolerated niece to unwelcome burden was a slow erosion of kindness. It began with small things: the thinnest slice of bread, the mending pile that was always hers, the quiet cessation of questions about her day. Her aunt, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched with worry, saw Delia not as her husband's kin, but as a rival for the already scarce attention of eligible bachelors for her own daughters. Delia was quiet, and she was pretty in a way that seemed to require no effort, a fact that her cousins resented with the fierce, unspoken competitiveness of young women in a town where a good marriage was the only available promotion. Delia took refuge in the skills her father had given her. She did the household accounts for her aunt with a speed and accuracy that was unsettling. She could tell by the sound of the ore wagons rumbling down C Street which mine they came from, judging by the rhythm of the wheels and the strain in the mule's traces. These small competencies, instead of endearing her, only served to mark her as different, an oddity. She did not complain. She did her chores, ate what she was given, and in the evenings, she would take out her father's hammer. Not to use it, but just to hold it. The smooth wood a conduit to a time when she was not a burden, but a beloved child. The end came on a Tuesday, as most ordinary endings do. It arrived without shouting or tears, delivered with the quiet finality of a business transaction. Silas asked her to remain at the kitchen table after the meager supper had been cleared. His wife and daughters vanished into the other rooms, leaving a silence that felt heavy and deliberate. Silas cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on a knot in the wooden tabletop. "Delia," he began, the word clumsy in his mouth. "Mr. Abernathy has made an inquiry." Delia felt a cold stillness spread through her chest. Mr. Abernathy was a merchant who owned the general store, a man of 50 with a sour disposition, damp hands, and a reputation for a temper that was as foul as the cheap cigars he chewed. He had buried 2 wives already. "He is a man of means," Silas continued, not looking at her. "He is prepared to make a formal offer of marriage. It would be a good match. It would secure your future." The unspoken words hung in the air between them, "and relieve us of you." Delia looked at her uncle's hands, calloused and stained from his work, hands that could break rock but trembled at this conversation. She thought of Mr. Abernathy's piggy eyes and wet cough. She thought of her father's belief in order and dignity. "I will not," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was as solid and unyielding as granite. Silas finally looked up, his expression a mixture of frustration and a strange, weary relief. He had done his duty, and she had refused. The consequences were now hers alone. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper and a small stack of bills held by a string. He slid them across the table. "This is what your father left," he said, his voice flat. "I've been holding it for you. $92. He pushed the paper after it. It was a formal, handwritten notice, informing her that she was to vacate the premises within 48 hours. It was an eviction. The cruelty of it was in its neatness, its administrative coldness. She was no longer family. She was a tenant in arrears. Delia looked from the money to her uncle's face and saw no malice, only the exhaustion of a man taking the path of least resistance. She did not beg or argue. She did not cry. She simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She stood, took the money and the notice and went to the small attic room that had been her cage for 2 years. She packed her few belongings, 2 dresses, a change of underthings, her father's small collection of geology books, into her leather satchel. She wrapped the geologist's hammer in her spare shawl and placed it carefully on top. By dawn, before the family was awake, she was gone, the front door closing with a soft click behind her, the sound of a life being shut away. The walk from her uncle's house on the dusty periphery of Virginia City to the town's chaotic center was like a journey through the layers of her own life. She passed the schoolhouse she had attended, the small church where her father's funeral had been held, the rows of miners' cottages, all identical in their hopeful fragility. The air was already beginning to warm, carrying the scent of coal smoke from the hoisting works and the ever-present alkali dust. The city was waking up. Heavy ore wagons, drawn by long teams of sweating mules, rumbled down the graded streets, their iron-rimmed wheels grinding grooves into the hard-packed earth. The ground itself seemed to vibrate with the ceaseless subterranean thunder of the stamp mills, a deep, percussive heartbeat that was the pulse of the Comstock. Men in heavy boots and flannel shirts, their faces smudged with dirt, nodded to her, their expressions shifting from rote politeness to a flicker of curiosity. She was a young woman, alone, carrying a satchel at an hour when respectable women were at their hearths. She knew the whispers would begin soon. Silas would tell a version of the story that painted him as a benevolent guardian and her as a stubborn, ungrateful girl. In a town this small, a reputation could be shattered as easily as a pane of glass. She kept her eyes forward, her back straight, her expression a careful mask of neutrality. She was Thomas Sharp's daughter, and she would not show them her fear. The landscape around her was a monument to brutal extraction. The slopes of Mount Davidson were stripped bare, denuded of the pinon and juniper that had once clung to them. In their place stood the great wooden headframes of the mines, the Gould and Curry, the Savage, the Hale and Norcross, and the colossal works of the Consolidated Virginia, a city of industry unto itself. They were like gallows, stark against the pale blue of the Nevada sky, their massive steam engines sighing plumes of white vapor. It was a place of immense wealth and immense desperation, and she was now adrift in it, a particle of dust in the great grinding machine. She found her way to the land office, a squat brick building on C Street that she had not entered since her father's death. The familiar scent of ink and old paper met her at the door, a painful echo of her childhood. She felt a pang of such profound loss that it almost buckled her knees. This place, once a sanctuary of learning and paternal love, was now just another institution where she was a stranger with a problem. She knew she could not afford to stay at one of the city's hotels. With the last of her resolve, she found a boarding house for women on a side street, a grim, narrow building run by a widow with a suspicious eye. She paid $2 for a week's rent on a cot in a shared room, the transaction leaving her with exactly $90. That night, lying in the dark, she listened to the coughing of the other women, the distant, unending pounding of the stamp mills, and the loud, frantic beating of her own heart. The $90, which had seemed a small fortune in her uncle's kitchen, now felt like a handful of dry leaves, ready to be blown away by the first gust of wind. She clutched the satchel containing her father's hammer, the one solid thing in a world that had turned to liquid. She had to find a piece of ground, a place to stand that was her own. It was the only way. The next morning, she rose before the others, washed her face in a basin of cold water, and walked back to the land office, her purpose settling over her like a heavy cloak. The Virginia City Land and Claims Office was a study in organized chaos. Tall stacks of ledgers and survey maps leaned against the walls, threatening to collapse under their own weight. The air was stale, layered with the ghosts of 1,000 cigars and the acidic tang of spilled ink. Behind the long, polished counter stood Mr. Henderson, the chief clerk, a man whose shoulders were permanently stooped from a life spent bent over documents. He was a contemporary of her father's, and his face registered a flicker of recognition, then pity, as Delia approached. He knew Silas Sharp, and he could guess the shape of her predicament. "Miss Sharp," he said, his voice a dry rustle, "what can the office do for you?" Delia placed her hands on the counter to still their trembling. "I'd like to see the plat map of abandoned and forfeited claims, please." Henderson raised a skeptical eyebrow. Filing a claim required capital for timber, tools, and labor, and he knew she had none. But he was a functionary, and this was a legitimate request. He heaved a massive cloth-bound book onto the counter and opened it. The page was a grid of squares and rectangles, a topographical map of the district overlaid with the boundaries of ownership. Many squares were filled with the bold, confident script of the big syndicates. Others, smaller and on the periphery, were marked with a faint F for forfeited or A for abandoned. Most of these are played out, Henderson warned gently. Or the geology's no good. A man could starve to death digging in the wrong place. Delia's finger traced the lines, moving away from the rich, crowded center of the lode, up the steep eastern slope of the mountain. Her father had taught her to look where others didn't, to read the negative space on a map. High up, near the summit, was a small, isolated square, colored a faded yellow, marked with a scribbled A. The entry in the ledger beside it was brief. Claim J17, the Jackrabbit. 5 acres. Last held by Miller, Evans, and Cobb. Forfeited due to non-payment of fees. Delia looked at Henderson. This one. What's the story? The clerk sighed, pushing his spectacles up his nose. That one's bad luck, miss. Pure and simple. The 3 men who last worked it, Miller, Evans, and Cobb, died in a collapse last spring. Went in one morning and never came out. The company that owns the next parcel, the Ophir North, sent a man up to look. He said the ground is rotten, fractured diorite all the way down, unworkable. They sealed the entrance. A cursed claim next to a major mine. Delia's mind snagged on the detail. Her father had once told her how the big companies would sometimes use rumors of unstable ground or bad air to scare off prospectors from adjacent claims, driving the price down so they could acquire the land for a pittance. It was a common, if ruthless, tactic. "What is the price to file?" she asked, her voice steady. "The filing fee is $10, Henderson said, "and the back taxes and acquisition cost come to $70. $80 total." He looked at her, his expression making it clear he thought it was a fool's purchase. $80. It would leave her with only $10 in the world. $10 to buy food, tools, and shelter. It was a desperate gamble, a leap into an abyss. But it was a piece of the mountain. It would be hers. The alternative was to dwindle her money away on boarding house rent until she was destitute and forced to accept a proposal like Mr. Abernathy's, or worse. "I'll take it," she said. Henderson stared at her for a long moment, then seemed to find some memory of her father's stubborn resolve in her face. He nodded slowly, reached for a fresh deed form, and dipped his pen in the inkwell. Delia counted out the $80 in worn bills. She signed the papers, her signature, Delia M. Sharp, clear and firm. He took up his embosser, and with a heavy thud, the official seal of the Story County Recorder was pressed into the paper. He slid the document across the counter. It was a simple piece of paper, but it was an anchor. It granted her title to 5 acres of rock and sagebrush and a collapsed hole in the ground that had already killed 3 men. It was all she had. The climb to the Jackrabbit claim was harder than she'd anticipated. The road gave way to a mule track, which in turn dissolved into a faint trail winding through sagebrush and shattered rock. The air grew thin and cool, and the ceaseless noise of the city below faded to a distant metallic hum. By the time she reached the claim markers, 4 simple wooden posts driven into the ground, the sun was high and hot, beating down on the treeless slope. The mine was little more than a ragged wound gouged into the mountainside. The entrance, or what was left of it, was a chaotic jumble of splintered timbers, rock, and earth. It looked less like a collapse, and more like the mountain had violently vomited out its contents. A few pathetic remnants of the previous miners' efforts lay scattered about. A pickaxe with its head sheared off, a rusted shovel with a split handle, a length of frayed rope half buried in the scree. It was a scene of total failure, radiating a palpable aura of despair. Anyone else would have turned back. But Delia saw it through her father's eyes. She ignored the wreckage and studied the geology. She looked at the color of the rock, the angle of the strata, the way the sunlight glinted off tiny inclusions in the stone. The surrounding rock wasn't the fractured diorite Henderson had mentioned. It was a solid wall of granite, one of the most stable formations. The story didn't fit. She spent the rest of that first day not digging, but observing. Using her hands and the broken shovel, she began to clear the smaller debris from the face of the collapse, piling the rocks neatly to one side. It wasn't an attempt to open the mine. It was an investigation, an autopsy of a disaster. As she worked, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. This was work she understood. The rock did not judge her. The mountain did not care that she was a woman or that she was alone. It simply was. That evening, she found a shallow rock overhang a few hundred yards from the mine entrance that offered minimal shelter from the incessant wind. This would be her camp. She walked back down to the city before dusk, her muscles aching, and spent her last $10 with grim precision. She bought a new hickory handle for the broken shovel head, 20 feet of good hemp rope, a box of candles, a small sack of hardtack, and a slab of dried jerky. Her entire worldly fortune was now a piece of paper, a few tools, and enough food for 3 days. She had nothing left to lose. For the next 2 days, she worked with a slow, methodical rhythm that bordered on ritual. She rose with the sun, ate a piece of hardtack, and began her labor. The work was dangerous. She used the rope to lash herself to a sturdy outcrop above the entrance, allowing her to lean over the pit and pry at the keystones in the rockfall. She tested every remaining timber with a gentle push, listening for the groan of stressed wood. She used her father's hammer to break larger rocks into manageable pieces, the sharp clink of steel on stone the only sound besides the wind. She was not frantic or desperate. She was patient, her movements as economical and precise as a surgeon's. She was her father's daughter, applying his lessons in the harshest classroom imaginable. Late in the afternoon of the second day, she uncovered something that made her stop. It was a piece of a shattered support beam, a 12 by 12 of new pine. It wasn't rotted or crushed from the weight of the rock above. It was splintered outwards, the fibers of the wood peeled back as if from a powerful explosion. A few feet away, she found another, and then another. The evidence was clear. The collapse had been caused by a force from inside the tunnel, not a cave-in from the top. The miners hadn't been buried by a failing roof. They had been blown up. Someone had used too much black powder, or set a charge in the wrong place, and that meant they had found something worth blasting for. On the third day, the sun rose into a sky the color of faded denim. A persistent wind whipped down from the summit, carrying a high, lonely sound. After hours of careful work, dislodging one rock at a time, Delia finally cleared a space at the top of the rockfall, a dark gap just large enough for a person to squeeze through. The air that seeped out was stale and cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and still. She secured her rope, lit one of her precious candles, and dripped a small pool of wax onto a flat stone to serve as a holder. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the candle ahead of her and slid feet first into the darkness. The passage was tight, the rough rock scraping her shoulders. After a few feet, the space opened up. She was in. She stood, holding the candle aloft. The tunnel was short, barely 20 feet long, ending abruptly in the wall of rubble she had just breached. This was the Jackrabbit Mine. It was a pathetic, shallow hole, hardly worth the name. The bodies of the 3 miners were likely buried deep within the rockfall. but as her eyes adjusted to the flickering light, she saw it. To the left of the main collapse, so close to the wall that it was almost hidden in shadow, was another opening. It was different from the entrance she had just cleared. The rock around it was worn smooth, its edges rounded by time, not chiseled by modern steel tools. A different air seemed to flow from it, colder and drier. It wasn't on any map her father had ever shown her. This was something else entirely. Her heart hammering against her ribs, she moved toward it. The opening was a low arch, just tall enough for her to enter without stooping. She stepped through and was in another world. The walls here were not the fractured, seamed rock of the outer tunnel, but smooth, solid granite. The passage was narrow and perfectly straight, as if laid out with intention. It was utterly silent. The sound of the wind, the distant city, everything was gone, swallowed by the immense weight of the mountain. She walked for what felt like a long time, the tiny flame of her candle pushing back an ocean of absolute blackness. The tunnel began to slope gently downwards. After perhaps 50 yards, it opened into a small chamber, no larger than a pantry. It was a worked-out stope, the end of the line, and there, on the smooth, flat face of the far wall, she saw the carvings. At first, she thought they were petroglyphs, the work of the ancient peoples who had lived in these mountains. But as she brought the candle closer, she saw that it was script. Letters. Formal, cursive, and distinctly Spanish. Her father, a man obsessed with the provenance of things, had insisted she learn the old languages of the territory: Paiute, Spanish, the shorthand of surveyors. It was a skill she'd thought useless, another of his strange hobbies. Now, standing in the cold heart of the mountain, she blessed his memory. She traced the carved letters with her fingertips, the rock cold against her skin. The Spanish was archaic, but clear. Por la gracia de Dios y la corona de España, she whispered, the words sounding loud in the stillness. Esta veta de plata, la veta de la serpiente emplumada, es concedida a la familia de Montoya en el año de nuestro Señor 1694. By the grace of God and the crown of Spain, this vein of silver, the vein of the plumed serpent, is granted to the Montoya family in the year of our Lord 1694, a Spanish land grant, carved into the rock. It predated the United States. It predated Nevada. It predated the discovery of the Comstock lode by 165 years. Then her candle flame caught a different kind of reflection. To the right of the inscription, running in a thick, dark band through the granite wall, was the vein itself. It wasn't the milky quartz the American miners sought, which held silver and gold in scattered particles. This was a solid, almost black ribbon of horn silver, argentite, so rich it was practically pure. The previous miners had been following a worthless little quartz stringer. They must have broken through into this ancient Spanish tunnel by accident, seen the grant, and seen this vein. In their frantic, gold-fevered haste to blast it open, they had used too much powder, bringing the newer, unstable American tunnel down on top of themselves, sealing this place away once more. A sudden, chilling realization washed over her. The Ophir North, whose claim bordered hers, was one of the deepest and most aggressive operations on the mountain. Their tunnels ran for miles. They were almost certainly following this same massive vein from their own side. And this grant, this carving in the wall, placed the origin, the apex of the vein, squarely within the boundaries of her 5-acre jackrabbit claim. They weren't her neighbors. They were trespassers. Delia backed out of the Spanish tunnel, her mind racing. The knowledge she now possessed was as dangerous as it was valuable. The Ophir North Mining Company was a behemoth, a syndicate of San Francisco bankers and corrupt politicians. They could crush her. A lone girl with a fantastic story about a 200-year-old carving would be dismissed as a lunatic, or worse. They could have her committed, or arrange an accident on her claim. No one would ask any questions. She understood that her only weapon was the one her father had always trusted, the law, but to wield it, she needed unimpeachable proof and powerful allies. Her first priority was to document everything. She spent the rest of the day in the cold darkness, working by candlelight. She took out the small notebook and pencil she always carried in her satchel and made a detailed sketch of the Spanish inscription, copying every letter, every flourish, with painstaking accuracy. Then, she began to map the tunnel system. She used the length of her rope to measure distances, sketching the relationship of the main Jackrabbit Tunnel to the older Spanish passage, noting the downward angle and the precise location of the exposed vein. Finally, using the pointed end of her father's hammer, she carefully chipped away several small, heavy samples of the dark ore, wrapping them in a piece of her shawl. This was her evidence. This was the beginning of her rebuilding. Not the rebuilding of a collapsed mine, but the construction of a legal fortress. As dusk settled, she concealed the entrance to the mine as best she could, rolling rocks and brush over the opening she'd made. She could not risk anyone else stumbling upon her discovery. She walked back down the mountain, not to the boarding house, but towards the more respectable part of town where the lawyers and judges lived. She needed counsel, but not just any lawyer. Most of the attorneys in Virginia City were on the payroll of one mining company or another. She needed someone her father had trusted. A name surfaced from her memory: Judge Miller. A retired circuit court judge, now in his 70s, with a reputation for being fiercely independent, deeply knowledgeable in mining law, and openly contemptuous of the syndicate's greed. Her father had called him the last honest man in Story County. She found his house, a modest but well-kept stone building with a small garden. She knocked on the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The door was opened by the judge himself, a tall, stooped man with a shock of white hair and eyes as sharp and clear as ice. He looked at the dusty, determined young woman on his doorstep with an expression of weary curiosity. "I am Delia Sharp," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "Thomas Sharp was my father." The judge's expression softened. "I remember Thomas. A good man, an honest clerk. Come in, child. You look like you've seen a ghost." She sat in his study, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound law books. With as much composure as she could muster, she laid out her story. She placed the deed to the Jackrabbit claim on his polished desk, followed by her hand-drawn map, her precise sketch of the Spanish grant, and finally, the heavy, ore-laden pieces of her shawl. She spoke plainly and factually, just as her father had taught her to present a case. Judge Miller listened without interruption, his sharp eyes moving from her face to the evidence she presented. He picked up one of the ore samples, his practiced hand weighing it, his thumb rubbing its dark, greasy texture. He studied her sketch of the grant, his lips moving silently as he translated the Spanish. When she finished, a long silence filled the room. "The apex law," the judge said, more to himself than to her. "The rights to the entire vein belong to the owner of the claim where the lode's apex, its highest point, is exposed." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of something other than pity in his eyes. It was respect. You say the Ophir North is working this same vein? I believe they are, Delia said. It is the only major formation on that side of the mountain. The judge leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. Well, Miss Sharp, he said, it appears you have them by the throat. He stood up. First, we need this ore assayed. I know a man, a Cornishman named Trelawney. He's honest and he doesn't like the Ophir board. Second, we need a lawyer. A young man, hungry and smart, not yet bought. I know him too. Elias Vance. This will make his career. The community was beginning to form, coalescing around her quiet resolve. The judge provided the wisdom and legitimacy. He was the first timber, sound, and well-placed. The rest would follow. The next morning, Judge Miller escorted Delia to the small, cluttered workshop of Mr. Trelawney, the assayer. He was a compact man with flowery white hair and hands permanently stained with the chemical evidence of his trade. He spoke in a soft, lyrical Cornish accent and moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who trusted process over pronouncements. He took Delia's ore samples without a word, placing one on a small anvil and striking it with a hammer. It didn't shatter like quartz. It flattened, a key characteristic of silver-rich ore. He grunted in approval, then proceeded with a fire assay, a meticulous process of crushing, melting, and chemical separation that Delia watched with rapt attention. The result, delivered 2 hours later, was staggering. The ore was over $3,000 a ton. It was bonanza grade, as rich as anything coming out of the core of the Comstock. Mr. Trelawney handed the certified report to Judge Miller, giving Delia a small, respectful nod. He was the second timber in her new structure. The proof. That afternoon, they met with Elias Vance. He was a young lawyer, barely 30, with a sharp suit and an even sharper mind. His ambition a palpable energy in Judge Miller's staid office. He listened to the story, his eyes alight with the sheer audacity of the case. A dispossessed orphan against the most powerful mining corporation in Nevada, armed with a 200-year-old Spanish carving. It was the stuff of legend. He peppered Delia with questions, testing the strength of her testimony, the accuracy of her maps, the details of her discovery. Her calm, precise answers impressed him. She was not a hysterical girl, she was a credible witness, and the daughter of a man the courts had respected. Elias Vance saw his chance to make a name for himself, to challenge the Goliaths of the Comstock. He agreed to take the case on contingency. He was the third timber. The weapon, armed with the deed, the assay report, and Delia's sworn affidavit, Elias Vance filed an injunction against the Ophir North Mining Company, demanding an immediate cessation of all work in their tunnels adjacent to the Jackrabbit claim. The company's superintendent, a florid, bull-necked man named Bannon, received the notice with a burst of incredulous laughter. The idea was preposterous. He threw the document in the trash. But the injunction was signed by Judge Miller, whose authority, even in retirement, carried immense weight. When court-martials arrived the next day to enforce the order, Bannon's laughter died in his throat. The hoisting works of the Ophir North fell silent for the first time in a decade. The legal battle that followed was a storm of paper and threats. Bannon's high-priced San Francisco lawyers descended on Virginia City, their strategy twofold: to intimidate Delia and to bury her claim in procedural motions. They offered her a buyout, $5,000 for the Jackrabbit claim, a generous offer for a worthless piece of land. Delia, with Judge Miller and Elias Vance at her side in Vance's small office, refused without hesitation. Bannon then tried slander, spreading rumors that she was a fraud, a fantasist, or worse, a woman of loose morals trying to extort the company. But Delia refused to be drawn out. She stayed in a quiet room at Judge Miller's house, and her stoic dignity, combined with the judge's unimpeachable reputation, made the mud-slinging backfire. The turning point came when Elias Vance, in a brilliant legal maneuver, petitioned the court for an official survey of the Spanish grant. The company's lawyers fought it furiously, an act that screamed of guilt, but the petition was granted. A court-appointed survey team, accompanied by Elias, Delia, and the company's engineers, entered the Jackrabbit mine. In the flickering lantern light of the ancient Spanish stope, the surveyors took their measurements, their faces a mask of professional neutrality. Their report, filed a week later, was undeniable. The Montoya grant of 1694 was legitimate. The Veta de la Serpiente Emplumada apexed squarely within the boundaries of the Jackrabbit claim. And the Ophir North's most profitable tunnel, their primary source of revenue for the past year, had crossed the property line and was actively removing ore from Delia's land. The company was trapped. To challenge the legality of the Montoya grant based on its age would be to challenge the principle of first in time, first in right, the very foundation upon which every claim on the Comstock lode was built. They would undermine their own title. They had no choice but to negotiate. At the final meeting, Bannon sat across the table, his face the color of raw meat. Delia, flanked by her allies, made her demand. She did not want to sell. She did not want a one-time payment. She wanted a royalty. 10% of the gross value of all ore extracted from the Veta de la Serpiente Emplumada in perpetuity. Bannon choked. It was an unheard-of figure. But as he looked at the quiet, unmovable young woman before him, he knew he had lost. The papers were signed. Delia Sharp, the disowned orphan with $92, was now one of the wealthiest individuals in Nevada. The people in town, who had once looked at her with pity or suspicion, now nodded with a deep and profound respect. She was not just rich, she had won. She had beaten the mountain, and she had beaten the men who thought they owned it. A year later, Delia stood by the window of her own house, a small, sturdy stone cottage on a quiet street near the courthouse. It was not a mansion, but it was solid and warm, and it was hers. The evening was settling over Virginia City, and the lights were beginning to flicker on, amber squares of warmth against the deep blue of the desert twilight. The air was cool, and the scent of pinon smoke from her own hearth filled the room. On the simple wooden mantelpiece above the stove sat two objects. One was her father's geologist's hammer, its hickory handle polished to a dark sheen from the oil of her hands, its steel head clean and bright. Next to it rested a single heavy piece of horn silver from her claim, its dark, crystalline surface absorbing the firelight. They were the two poles of her life, the tool of knowledge her father had given her, and the fruit of that knowledge, wrested from the mountain's heart. She looked out at the sprawling, chaotic city, the sound of the stamp mills, a sound that had once been the soundtrack to her loneliness and fear, was now a comforting, rhythmic assurance of her own prosperity. She thought of her father, Thomas Sharp. He had never sought wealth, only understanding. He had believed in the quiet authority of facts, the integrity of the law, and the stories that the rocks told. He had not left her a fortune in dollars, but he had given her the tools to claim her own kingdom, a trained eye, a disciplined mind, and the courage to look where others had given up. He would have been proud. A quiet smile touched her lips as she thought of her Uncle Silas. News traveled fast in Virginia City. He and his family would know of her astonishing reversal of fortune. They would understand, with the bitter clarity of hindsight, the immense value of the young woman they had so carelessly cast out for the sake of convenience and a distasteful marriage proposal. There was no triumph in the thought, no thirst for revenge. There was only a quiet, settled sense of justice, as solid and real as the stone walls of her house. The mountain had held its secrets for centuries, waiting. It had held the legacy of the Montoya family, who had marked their claim with faith and courage, and it had held the bodies of the 3 miners who had died in their frantic greed. The mountain gave its gifts only to those who approached it with respect, patience, and understanding. Delia had listened, and it had answered. She reached out and picked up the hammer. Its weight was a familiar comfort, a tangible link to her father's hand, to his love. The steel was cool against her skin, but for the first time since his death, she felt a profound and unshakable warmth deep within her. She was no longer an orphan adrift in a hostile world. She was home. Her new life had taken on a rhythm as steady and dependable as the geology that supported it. The house, which she had bought and furnished with care, was no longer just a shelter, but a place of quiet contentment. Its silence was not the empty, resentful silence of her uncle's attic, but a peaceful quiet, filled with the soft ticking of a mantel clock and the whisper of the fire. The rumble of the ore wagons was a constant reminder of the royalty payments being deposited in her name at the bank, a river of wealth flowing down from the mountain. But the money was secondary to the community she had built. Judge Miller had become a grandfather to her, visiting twice a week to play chess and discuss the politics of the territory. His housekeeper, a stern but kind woman named Mrs. Gable, was patiently teaching Delia the art of cooking, and her small kitchen was now often filled with the scent of baking bread. Elias Vance had become a trusted friend and advisor, their professional relationship blossoming into a warm camaraderie. They would walk together on weekends, not up the mountain, but through the sagebrush flats, discussing books and law and the future of Nevada. Mr. Trelawney, the quiet Cornish assayer, managed her investments with a prudence that bordered on artistry, ensuring her fortune would last. These people formed her new family, a family forged not by blood, but by mutual respect and shared struggle. They had seen her not as a helpless girl, but as a competent and determined woman, and they had stood with her. She had earned her place. She ran a hand over the smooth handle of her father's hammer. The $92 her uncle had given her had seemed like both a pittance and a king's ransom on that desperate morning. It had been the price of her freedom, a severance from a life that would have suffocated her. She had taken that pittance and invested it not in a sure thing, but in a cursed, abandoned hole in the ground, a place of death and failure. She had trusted her father's teachings over the fearful warnings of others. She had bought a pile of rocks and a whispered curse, and through patience and knowledge, she had found a hidden kingdom. Delia Sharp was 19 now, and she was home. She had arrived in Virginia City as a child, been cast out as a girl, and had now taken her place as a woman of substance and respect. She had $92 to her name when she walked out of her uncle's house, and she had spent 80 of it on a cursed patch of rock on the side of a barren mountain. It was the best $80 she ever spent. What forgotten piece of knowledge from your own family has proven to be the most valuable? Share your story with us in the comments, and if you found value in Delia's journey, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to see it.